Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out, for your time, for your presence. We hope you had a very nice spring break. I can't believe end of March is already here, right? We're very delighted today to be hosting Professor Todd Heny, someone who has been at the forefront of radical Korean history. I'm André Kim. I'm a historian of Korea at Manoa. But before we start, we want to say something about this place. We want to honor the indigenous land and people of Hawaii, the Kanaka Maoli. We recognize and strive to learn more about the history and culture of the Kanaka Maoli, and the CKS, this center, is grateful to have flourished for the past 50 years on this beautiful borrowed land. Now, I would like to ask the center director, Tae Beck, someone who has made radical history in his own kind of way, to come up here and say a few words of welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to join this wonderful intellectual feast that we are having at the Center for Korean Studies. As a director of the Center for Korean Studies, I'm very delighted to welcome today's speaker, Professor Todd Heny from the University of California, San Diego. I understand Todd is Associate Professor of History and is the author of Assimilating Seoul, Japanese Rule and the Politics of Public Space in Colonial Korea, 1910 to 1945, which was published by University of California Press in 2014, and Queer Korea, published by Duke University Press in 2020, and Korean translation has been also published in 2023. As you may know, Professor André Kim, who is the chair of a publication committee, actually proposed to have this book talk series, and we are very happy to see this second event happening today with an excellent speaker. And for this semester, these two talks are all for the series, but I'm looking forward to have opportunity to invite more authors in the future for. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Hold on, Todd.
What?
Hold on. I have a formal introduction of you.
Oh,
so
okay.
our speaker, Todd Heny, is Associate Professor of Korean History at the University of California, San Diego. He received his PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles, but I know that he's a Midwestern kid.
Yes.
Todd has published widely in the Journal of Asian Studies, Positions, Journal of Korean Studies, Transgender Studies Quarterly, among others. Todd is the author of Assimilating Seoul, which came out of the University of California Press in 2014. This book is a staple of all Korean history classes around the world. Todd has also recently produced a documentary film called Paradise about male homosexual culture during the 1970s and 80s South Korea, and I know that it's slowly making the circuit, the film series, film festivals, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's wonderful. In 2020, Todd published Queer Korea, which came out of Duke University Press. This book has made big waves. It's open access. It's available to everybody. By the way, both books, Assimilating Seoul and this book, have been translated into Korean, which is a sign of their significance. In the book, Queer Korea, Todd writes, I propose that the obscured queerness of the peninsula's recent past provides critical insights to overcome the current impasse of both LGBTI activism and neoliberal consumerism, allowing Koreans to forge intergenerational alliances, cross-community collaborations, and a rehabilitated mass politics that looks beyond individualized suffering and state protection. a more radical and expansive model of intergenerational cooperation and post-identity alliances across class offers a viable alternative to the current milieu of despair and fragmentation. I just love that statement. Today, in this presentation, Todd continues with this theme of radical queer history as a way to bring us together. Let's bring Todd up here.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes.
Thank you so much for having me. I want to thank the director, Professor Peck and Professor Kim, as well as Courtney, Heny, and all of the staff who helped make my visit possible. I'm really happy to be here. I also want to reiterate my own appreciation for being on this land, a land that the US colonized. And I wanted to try to make a presentation that gestures at how history of Hawaii might be incorporated into Korean studies. This just preliminary work that I'm doing. I was just speaking a little bit earlier. Probably if you're over 35 years of age and grew up in Korea or have Korean contacts, you probably have heard of André Kim.
Yes.
But there's almost no scholarship on him. And so I wanted to try to put together something that would gesture at not only his importance, but how to incorporate individuals like him into Korean history. So this is my first attempt to do that. The picture you see here, I'll show a lot of images, but this actually is from Hawaii. André Kim came to Hawaii 8 times between 1972 and 1996. He was quite a fan. One thanks before I begin. This is to André Kim's adopted son, Kim Jung-do, who you can see here on the left, who is now in charge of André Kim's studio in Seoul. And he was very helpful to me in making available many archives and materials that André Kim still has. And you can see a picture of him as a young child when he was about 5 years old when he came to Honolulu in 1987. So that's André Kim next to him and the son, and of course the many people who are wearing his dresses. For those of you who aren't familiar with André Kim, if you were growing up in South Korea and you went to an André Kim show and you wore one of his dresses, you had made it in South Korea. That was a sign of, success for actors and other kinds of celebrities. So although undoubtedly South Korea's most famous male fashion designer before he passed in 2010, André Kim, who was born Kim Bongnam in 1935, has received little academic attention despite his domestic and global fame. I first saw his trademark dresses myself over 20 years ago in a special exhibit, and have since wondered how scholars might position him in recent history. Today's talk, which is my first on André Kim, uses his life and career to locate some of the origins of the late 1990s Hallyu, Korea wave boom, in what I call hetero-authoritarianism. I use this term in my forthcoming book, Prophets of Queerness, to reassess South Korea from the 1950s to 1970s, but do so through the perspective of same-sex sexuality and gender variance. That's why I call it hetero-authoritarianism. Korea wave scholars are better positioned than I am to identify relevant precursors, things that you see in my talk, which are related to things that we're watching today with the popularity of Korea's global K-pop culture. My own goal is a little less ambitious, and it's simply to try to place this designer in an analysis of eccentric professions. This is what the mass media referred to men who worked in the female-dominated world of fashion, among other cross-gendered jobs. In a minute, I will survey the scope and meaning of such service labor, performed both by men who were fashion designers and hairdressers, as well as women who in the 60s and 70s were doing what was considered to be male-dominated jobs. And I think this is an understudied area of inquiry when compared, let's say, to factory labor. So we have Professor Hagen Koo here, who I was just mentioning. I always assign his work to talk about labor history. So here I want to expand our history of labor to also include service labor. While frequently staging overseas shows, André Kim made quite a reputation for himself. He was one of the sort of pioneers, not only in clothing, but also in branding, in charity work, and also I want to show you as well, he had quite an important role in social justice issues as well. So he functioned as something like a cultural ambassador for South Korea as his country transformed itself from a war-torn nation after the Korean War into a capitalist powerhouse. Now, André, as you see from his name, adopted a French-sounding name, and he was known to speak Korean as if he was raised in Paris. These were two of the many techniques that he used to promote his clothing brand and, by extension, his post-colonial nation. As one report from 1964 about his unusual accent mentioned, quote, "To make the deception complete, he stammers a bit, the way a Korean would do after years of overseas stay." We can see a characterized version of André speaking Korean with a French accent in this clip I'm going to show you from a comedy film called 남자 미용사, or Male Hairdresser, which along with fashion designer was another cross-gender job that was popularly marked as eccentric or odd, or we might even say queer. The director Shim Usop mastered this genre of the gender-bending comedy film, which borrowed from newspaper weeklies and offered viewers, especially the working class and especially men, an inexpensive way to have entertainment by urging them to laugh at more abject citizens than themselves. So you can consider the film a gesture at working class citizens to sort of laugh and make fun of people who are even more downtrodden than themselves. And they did that by focusing on the queerness of other people. So in the film, André is cast as an effeminate, long-haired blonde stylist who works among women and entertains bourgeois customers as much as he styles their hair in unconventional ways and offers them other kinds of strange services like a, quote, meditation-style massage that he purportedly learned while studying in France. So let me show you a clip from the 1968 film.
Bonjour, moi André.
어머, 모기가.
놀랄 것 없습니다. 플라즈 남자 미용사 헤어스타일입니다.
네, 그래요. 자, 모두들 인사해요. 프랑스에서 귀국하신 앙드레 선생님이셔. 여기 좀 앉으세요. 앉으세요. 괜찮아요.
감사합니다.
어서 오세요. 남자 미용사가 새로 왔다면서. 네. 아이, 어서 오세요, 이마다.
꽁막 자네는?
저 프랑스에서 귀국한 지 얼마 안 되는 앙드레 씨예요. 잘 좀 부탁해요.
아직도 마담.
앉으세요. 자, 준비도 해요. 네.
So sorry I didn't put subtitles on it, but it's basically, you know, he's just come back from France and he's speaking with this French accent. So you can already see, although cast here as the hairdresser, that this comes from André Kim, the fashion designer. He was well known and picked up already in 1968. In real life, the cosmopolitan designer was known to gift evening dresses to the wives of American and European dignitaries, ambassadors in Seoul, who would take his dresses back to France and Milan, and they would promote his garments when they went back home. And to advance his brand, he also traveled extensively to the United States, Europe, almost every continent of the world at a time when few South Koreans could leave the country, let alone travel. As one New York-based newspaper commented in 1970, quote, "He gets around almost as much as a space capsule." By analyzing his globetrotting activities, especially here in Hawaii and the US mainland, I tried to show that his repeated visits to the West, especially the West Coast of the US and Hawaii, allowed him to exploit these first world markets while they also advanced international understanding, post-colonial reconciliation, and social justice. André's iconic status as a fashion star and a representative of a rapidly industrializing South Korea, I also show, softened popular views of cross-gender laborers as odd or eccentric or queer, suggesting that at least some non-normative men could use professional success to transcend personalized accusations of deviant queerness. So before I begin to talk about André Kim specifically, let me just give you a little bit of an overview about this genre of writing about eccentric workers in South Korea. So the term that often appears is 이색 직업. I translated this as eccentric professions. And you can see the range of individuals who were discussed in this particular way. So I break these into two groups in my book. The first one deals with female-born individuals who were eccentric workers if they became soldiers, they became professional wrestlers, they became the president of their company, they became taxi drivers, or they became police officers. So in this sort of cross-gendering female sex workers were often described as independent subjects. So the taxi driver who would literally drive away from family, drive away from patriarchy, become independent by making a wage. That's how they were discussed. And as you can imagine, taking the example of the taxi driver, they were often objects of everyday sexism and masculinist violence. So as they drove, they met male customers who treated them as if they were barmaids. So in a way, women who are doing masculine kind of jobs are portrayed in this kind of way as being a danger or a threat to public space that men somehow counter by either engaging in sexism or engaging in some kind of violence. Now, men who are doing cross-gender labor are quite different. They're often described as being creative or nurturing people. So here you can see the man who is a nurse. But largely they are not seen as some kind of threat, but instead as something that's laughable. And that goes back to that comedy film I showed you, where you literally, with a collective audience, they're objects of everyday laughter. So that might be true, for example, of men who dance. And it's also the case with people who are born men but who crossed as women and sold their bodies. So these are transgender sex workers. They experience violence on the street. So I should say that they're slightly different from the other men who are engaged in service labor. But as a general point, I think there's this difference between those men who are doing service labor that was marked as feminine and women who are doing masculine labor. Here are some other images of men who are doing eccentric jobs. This would have included fashion designers as well as hairdressers. The one thing I can also say about men is that the more famous and global they were, people like André Kim, the less attention was paid to their sort of eccentricity or their queerness. So this was also something that was extremely difficult for women who are doing service labor jobs that are being marked as masculine to leave the realm of queerness or eccentricity in the way that famous stars like André Kim were able to do. So in that sense, André is a bit exceptional. But I did want to introduce sort of where he fits in these general patterns. So now let me move on to talk about André as a kind of eccentric laborer. Starts with Seoul fashion shows, and then he becomes a global star. So André Kim, as you saw from his dates, born in 1935, so he lived through the end of the colonial period. He lived through the Korean War. He grew up on the outskirts of Seoul as the fourth child in a farming family of 2 sons and 3 daughters. According to many autobiographical accounts of him, he spent his youth watching romantic comedies by foreign directors such as William Wyler's Roman Holiday, which you see here, and other films. He was especially moved by the beauty of Audrey Hepburn, who appeared in this film as well as other films that he was watching on screen at the time. André dreamt of a career where he could express himself artistically, so he dabbled in painting, sketching, poetry, and music, and he eventually settled on a career in fashion design, a career that no South Korean man had ventured to enter. So in 1959, he enrolled in this school, the International Design School. You can see some images, and among them some men, although there were quite few. He enrolled into school in 1959 and graduated in 1962. So you might imagine that he had gone to study fashion in Paris, but in fact he did this in Seoul. This is his mother and his father. The fashion show, a seasonal presentation that were only conducted by female designers, and charity work catapulted André Kim as the country's first and foremost fashion designer. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, there were about 20 men who had become designers, but he was obviously the most famous. He opened his own salon at the entrance of Myeongdong, which is, of course, Seoul's cultural center, at least at that time. And he presented his first fashion show in 1962 at the Pando Hotel. So this is a short newsreel from 1963, the year after he did his first fashion show. Again, it's not subtitled, but it just basically says that he's doing these fashion shows, and they're very popular among Koreans and foreign residents of Korea as well.
서울 안도텔 다이너스티 룸에서는 수많은 주한 외국부인들이 모인 가운데 앙드레 킴의 의상 발표회가 있었는데 모델로 나선 헤어 질량과 원가 유량 등의 멋있는 맵시가 인기였습니다. 그런데 요즘 서울에서 갖는 패션쇼는 그 범위가 외국인들에게도 인정을 받아서 우리나라 디자이너들의 기술이 국제적 수준에 이르고 있음을 보여주었습니다.
To promote his brand, André partnered with local charities, donating a portion of the proceeds to less fortunate people. In 1965, for example, he took his latest fashions to Suwon to host a sweet charity for a local school that educated disabled children. This was also an opportunity to transform hotel ballrooms into extravagant and spectacular places that not only featured dresses, but André spent a lot of time choreographing the music and creating the stage as well. So as one journalist wrote about the stunning transformation of a hotel ballroom for this event, quote, "It was converted into an underwater fairyland with a backdrop of underwater plants, coral, and fish, including a mermaid." So you can get a sense of how much energy and money he put into these fashion shows. In early 1967, he hosted another charity fashion show, donating $2,300 of the proceeds to construct a new building and a camp for the YMCA. Other contributors included Park Jung-hee's wife, Yuk Young-soo, who, as we know, was assassinated by two North Korean sympathizers in 1974. Among those who benefited from these donations were 30 children with intellectual disabilities. And here we can also see André Kim partnering with other important figures like Lee Bang-ja, also known as Masako, and she was the wife of the Crown Prince Iyun. So you can see both of them attending this charity fashion show in 1967. From the mid-1960s, André's shows began to target international clients, both living in Korea and international clients overseas, presenting himself and his designs to cosmopolitan audiences. In 1965, for example, the International Women's Club, which was founded in 1956 to promote friendship between South Korea and its anti-communist allies, hosted a benefit at the French embassy that was attended by nearly 400 celebrities, including the First Lady herself. At this event, André appeared alongside a well-known fashion designer from the Philippines, an anti-communist ally of both South Korea and the United States. So here we can see how the fashion shows are very much tied up in the geopolitics of the particular moment. Here, André presented 40 new dresses, donating the earnings from this event to support the clubs. This is the International Women's Club, their philanthropic projects, and an annual scholarship for needy families. So this is a trademark, actually, of André's shows, this kind of charity promotion. And we can already see him by the mid-60s reaching this international audience. He also wrote a lot of editorials. So the English language publications you see here this is the English version of the Korea Times. And this also enabled André to reach an even wider audience of both domestic and foreign consumers. So a couple of months before the 1965 charity I showed you, he published this article in the Korea Times on the Travelers Ensemble, as he called that year's summer line. And here André addressed the Anglophone readers, whom he reminded people were a great deal of his customers. So in this article, he talks about a new piece called the arirang dress, a Korean-inspired modern ensemble to be worn with or without the traditional jacket, the chogori. In addition to Western women with Orientalist tastes, André created this dress for privileged nationals who could afford advanced learning. And as he told these readers in the article, quote, "From now on until early September, not a few Korean students will go abroad and study further, especially on the occasion of the fall semester opening at colleges and universities in the United States." So I'm wondering what privileged Korean students wore André's arirang dress when they went back to Wellesley or U of H or wherever they happened to end up. So having worked tirelessly to build his reputation among foreign customers, André soon would take his clothing overseas. And this was the most remarkable thing, actually, looking at the research, is how early he held fashion shows on almost every continent, and eventually signs contracts, the first ever, to sell ready-made clothing, 기성복, in the United States and other global markets. So you have to remember at the time when he was designing clothes, these were one-off pieces. You'd buy one piece. It wasn't like you go to Tory Richards and buy, the Aloha shirt that's made for thousands of customers. So André quickly moves into this ready-made clothing market. And he does this by visiting overseas countries. I had already mentioned that he was known, he had this connection to France because of his accent, and he donated dresses to the wives of ambassadors, so it makes sense that the first place he goes to, you can see him here in 1966, is Paris, standing below the Eiffel Tower. So in 66, he visited France, Italy, Spain, and then the US on his way back to Korea. Invited by the company that supported such global stars as Coco Chanel and Pierre Cardin, He first visited the fashion capital of Paris, and at the Eiffel Tower had 5 French models wear his Korean-esque gowns made of silk satin, silk chiffon, and brocade. And so you can see not only his travels over here in Italy, but also these French publications and these French models who are wearing his clothes. A local reporter in the French press lauded these styles, calling André a magician of the fairy spectacle. And André continued to make his own pronouncements about his visits to Europe. As he said about his 1966 trip, quote, "Shocking pink, the top fashion color of the past spring in Korea, is now sensationally popular in Europe this season. I felt that we even advanced it." You can see his ego is there as well. On the way back, he stops in the United States. This event was hosted by the Korean ambassador, and at the ambassador's residence invited the wives of American politicians, including the First Lady of the President at the time, Lyndon Johnson. And you can see from these images these high-ranking wives of government officials wearing his dresses, which the Washington Post described as, quote, "classical costumes of ancient Korea and striking modern adaptations for evening wear." In contrast to the fashion-forward designs that white American women tended to prefer, the ambassador's own daughter modeled a style that, in terms of the US-South Korean relationship, embodied the latter's, that is South Korea's, pre-modern traditions. One reporter described her Choson-era style as follows, quote, "She peaked a pixie face of a fluffy circle, part of a costume to hide their faces." So we can see this kind of contrast that's being drawn between the dresses worn by Koreans and the dresses worn by white customers. To create a multi-sensory experience, he combined this collection of clothing with a variety of musical pieces that was played by Reverend Andrew Wang, a Korean church pastor who played several ancient Korean instruments, including the kayagum. So you can imagine the kind of Orientalist spectacle that's happening here at the South Korean ambassador's residence. And again, André had this way of promoting himself and his brand in ways, I think, that's very much connected to the Korean wave these days. So in the case of his visit in 1966, he donated 12 dresses to the guests of the ambassador's wife. This included Lady Bird, who, when she visited South Korea, I believe it was the next year, wore André Kim's black dress when she met Park Jung-hee's wife. So you can see how he is very much embedded in the kind of international politics of the day. The black dress he called the Sokguram Cave Temple. So he was he was really using Korea's cultural traditions to make a name for himself. He returned to Seoul at the end of 1966, and he took advantage of this world tour to begin to produce ready-made clothing for international sales. This was really a personal and national branding venture that was a first for Korea. And as he became this international star, the kind of rumors about his personal life and about his own sort of career in this female-dominated profession slowly begins to disappear as he becomes this global icon that represents Korea. So, buoyed by this enthusiastic reception, but still without a way to sell his clothing in the US, he soon embarked on commercial ventures with foreign distributors. And this was a first for any Korean fashion designer, and one that André would continue to promote throughout his career. So he signed several contracts. The first was in 1968 with the Samuel Corporation for $35,000. And you can see when he returns to the US, this is a picture from 1968 in one of his fashion shows. This is a bridal dress event, and this helps to launch his brand internationally. So they begin to sell his label at department stores for prices ranging from $90 to $360. After New York, he goes to Chicago, where he signs another contract with the Electric Color Company, which allowed for him to sell 480 ready-made items in 30 different design styles. So by the late 1960s, he has signed a variety of these contracts, which not only bring him personal profit, but increase his notoriety globally. So having fully established himself as a pioneering designer and cosmopolitan entrepreneur, André later made several important visits to Hawaii and California. Once ruled by the Hawaiian Kingdom and an independent Mexico, this is Hawaii and California, both annexed states of a growing American empire, and also an empire where nearly 70,000 Korean migrants lived. By 1980, the number of Koreans living in the United States, including Hawaii, was 350,000. So given this large population of Korean Americans, André Kim draws on this population and serves as a kind of bridge between an anti-communist South Korea on the one hand and South Korea's most important Cold War ally, that is the United States. And by doing this, he's able to kind of stitch a capitalist world together into a new kind of community. Of course, it's an uneven community with many different ethnic groups, but nonetheless, this is where André Kim's attention goes, beginning in 1972, when he makes his first visit here to Honolulu to show his pieces, 85 pieces at the Sheraton Waikiki, including hybrid Korean and Western style dresses, as well as native inspired gowns under the rubric of Hawaii Beautiful. In a pattern that would repeat itself in years to come, a number of local sponsors would host this event. Now, the first person to invite André Kim to Hawaii was Jean Ariyoshi. Jean Ariyoshi was the first lady during the 1970s. Her husband, of course, George, was the first Asian American governor of Hawaii. Jean was head of the Lawyers' Wives of Hawaii at the time, and she played a leading role in bringing André to Hawaii in 1972. She's still with us today. She's about 88 or 89. I had a phone conversation with her recently to figure out how she figured out about André Kim. She told me that she visited South Korea in the 60s and 70s, came across his dresses, and thought that it would be a great thing for people of Hawaii to see. These images, part of an illustrated magazine article about his Hawaiian expedition. Hawaii Wonjong was the term that was used in the Korean press, demonstrates the kind of eclectic styles that he created, trying to incorporate colors from Hawaii into this unique fashion style. Although local leaders like Jean Ariyoshi had invited André to their island, and he had sought to validate its multiple traditions, the media's use of the aggressive term expedition reveals how some people in the media linked his trans-Pacific work of being a cultural ambassador to a nationalist drive for capital accumulation. Meanwhile, for Koreans who saw his show in 1972, this was an opportunity, an uncanny chance to recall their homeland and to experience Korea as an industrializing country. And I think it would have served a meaningful source of their national pride to be able to be involved in his visits. Following trips to Southeast Asia in the mid-1970s to promote his country's culture, André returned to the US in 1977 to celebrate the 75th anniversary of Korean migration to the United States, particularly to Hawaii. During this trip, diasporic Koreans celebrated him as a co-ethnic icon who, although perhaps eccentric in terms of his career, softened tensions caused by interconnected histories of American military imperialism in the Asia-Pacific region and South Korean or Korean migrants who remained racially and economically marginalized in their new homeland in the US. Before arriving in Honolulu in August of 1977, the local press here reminded residents of the long history of Korean migration to the Hawaiian Islands. The Honolulu Star Bulletin, for example, interviewed Teresa Kim, who at the age of 18 sailed into Honolulu in 1916 with 9 other young women, all so-called picture brides, who soon married male migrants already working on the island's many plantations. After settling in Kalihi Valley, the Kim family dedicated themselves to farming, cultivating bananas and pineapples before shipping them to California. When the fruit business declined thereafter, Mrs. Kim shifted to kimchi making, ensuring the family's economic well-being and instilling in her 10 children and 20 grandchildren a sense of national pride. She was one of 15 members from this first group of Korean migrants whom organizers of the 1977 celebration recognized at commemorative events, which included a trade fair, a joint workshop service, a family picnic, a culinary show, a cultural exhibit, and a dance performance. So André Kim's fashion show was the first of these celebrations. And as in the past, it was local residents who arranged his visit. In this case, it was the Honolulu Korean and Chinese JCs and the Oahu State JCETs who organized this event and used it to elevate their position in the multi-ethnic politics of post-war Hawaii. This commemorative event followed André's trademark eclecticism, showcasing 7 programs that represented folkloric traditions of the Middle East, Africa, Spain, of course his home country. The programs were called, just to give you a sense of what you would have seen at one of these fashion shows, the 7 programs were Gypsy Romance, Arabesque, Kilimanjaro, Flying Swan, the Korean Fantasia, etc., etc. As you might imagine, for Koreans who are going to this fashion show and gravitating towards the Korean designs, this was yet another opportunity for them to bask in Korea's popularity. André Kim, after the show, reportedly wrote about the 1977 event, quote, "After the show, the audience, most of whom were descendants of Korean immigrants, swarmed behind the curtain for my autograph. Some asked about purchasing the robes, but I had no mind to sell them at all." Here again is a picture of Jean Ariyoshi sitting next to Lee Bang-ja in 1977 for the celebration in 1977. So he leaves Honolulu in 1977 and he goes to the United States to continue the 75th year celebration of Korean migration to the US. Of course, LA was home to the largest population of overseas Koreans, most of them having arrived after 1965 due to recent changes in immigration laws. Of the 354,000 Korean people in the US by 1980, about 30% of them resided in Southern California. And so you can imagine many of them are going out and celebrating in Koreatown the 75th year anniversary of their migration. This is several images that André Kim's son, Kim Jung-do, shared with me, and I think these are very important, and I'll explain in a minute. During one of these events in LA, André appeared with Philip Ahn, another cultural icon of the 20th century. Philip Ahn was, of course, born as the son to An Chang-ho after his parents moved to the US in 1902. Philip, of course, grew up in LA, was a Hollywood star, appeared in more than 180 film and movie credits, many of them during the pre-45 era, appearing as ethnic Japanese rather than as Korean. And that André appeared here alongside this Korean-American star in 1977, I think indicates the degree to which these male pioneers had created successful roles for themselves in female and white-dominated professions of fashion design for André Kim and the white-dominated profession of Hollywood movies, which Philip Ahn was a part of. So in this slide, you can see the two of them sitting together in an open car as onlookers cheer them on for the 4th annual Korea Day on September 18th, 1977. And a few other images you can see André Kim standing here with Korean Americans as they celebrate. This event was sponsored by the LA branch of the Korea Times. And so here you can see some images from that local publication, which is available at USC in Los Angeles. It was widely advertised in the local Korean newspaper. To attract Korean American and other audiences, the organizers kept the ticket prices very low and attracted a huge audience that attended this commemoration and was covered also by local TV stations. Over the coming years, he continued this mission of linking his home country and the broader world by collaborating with local Korean communities. In 1979, for example, André left for his first trip to South America, traveling to Chile and Argentina to show 150 new creations, some of which combine Korean aesthetics with those of the countries that he visited. In Buenos Aires, which is one of his stops, the Korean Society of Argentina partnered with the local Women's Association to host a fashion show, revealing how links to diasporic communities help communicate his work to the societies where expatriates live. As an indication of his success in this regard, take, for example, his visit to Santiago. You can see this publication, which was printed in Chile's largest women's magazine called Paula, and even published this feature on South Korean culture after his visit, which includes 16 stills of his designs and this long article in Spanish which says André Kim, the great Oriental designer. Although not always as successful, his efforts at bringing together the world and easing tensions between local communities often also, you can see, repeated in future fashion shows. And this is particularly significant with local Japanese communities. So visiting Honolulu for a third time in 1980, Hawaii once again became an important site for André Kim's interventions into post-colonial politics. In that year, André Kim, a Korean American who was participating in the Japanese American Cherry Blossom Festival, invited André back for another visit. And it was the first time that this Japanese dominated event, the Cherry Blossom Festival, invited a South Korean as part of their celebrations. And this was quite remarkable to me, at least considering the ongoing tensions between Korea and Japan. Commenting on superb reviews from local critics about his 1977 show, the Japanese organizers of the 1980 event invited him, quote, "in the spirit of cultural understanding and international exchange that is the trademark of our annual Cherry Blossom Festival." That a South Korean was chosen as a representative of this event indicates André's ability to mediate between ethnic Japanese and Koreans. Useful in this regard was an invitation from the governor's mansion, from the governor's wife, to host a party. Here we can see another image of Jean Ariyoshi, the woman who brought André Kim to Honolulu for the first time. This is actually one of his dresses. This is the visit of Queen Elizabeth and Philip to Honolulu in 1975, and she's wearing his dress. Wow. And here you can see the 1980 Cherry Blossom Festival, sponsored by the Honolulu Japanese Chamber of Commerce, and then you can see an image from the booklet about his fashion show. So André, having been invited by Japanese, returned the favor, working to improve South Korea's relations with its former colonizer. To this end, he hosted a party for Japanese actors and entertainment promoters who had visited Seoul in the past and were attending the Cherry Blossom Festival. So here were Japanese visiting Hawaii and him sort of setting up these meetings. And several newspapers I read said that representatives from both South Korea and Japan discussed how to improve relations at a time, you will remember, when Japanese popular culture was still officially banned in Korea. And so Hawaii serves as this other space in which South Korea and Japanese reconciliation can take place. Even as André worked to soften relations with Japanese, the connection of his clothing to Hawaii, the site of his third fashion show in Honolulu, created a more complex, if troubling, history that included elements of what cultural critics would today call cultural appropriation. Although not officially part of his 1980 fashion show at the Hilton Hotel, this photojournalistic essay that was published in one of South Korea's most important women's magazines displays the telltale expressions of nativist exploitation. Entitled Sun Festival, this 4-page essay contains 7 photos, 4 of which feature half-naked indigenous men wearing loincloths, whereas 3 smaller photos only feature André's dresses on white and Asian models appearing in front of the ocean. 4 large photos displayed this native resident, indigenous Hawaiian resident, lying down on the sand as 3 well-heeled models display their white dresses. Other photos of his models show how André incorporated a native palette into floral designs that above all highlighted the unique fashion lines of Korean dresses. A reporter from the women's magazine vividly described this maneuver as combining, quote, raw colors of Southern passion with his country's clothing customs in creating, quote, an even more magical atmosphere. And we can continue to see this kind of use of native Hawaiian bodies as a kind of sort of gratuitous backdrop to his fashion shows. So this is a video image of his 6th Hawaiian fashion show, which I'll explain in a minute, from 1987. And I just show you the clip to show you how native peoples and elements were incorporated into his shows. And this is also thanks to his son, who kept all of his old VHS and Betamax tapes, which I had to convert and digitize. But you can kind of see this kind of thing. This is like right in the middle of the show. I mean, he's a good-looking man, but I'm not sure what it has to do with.
Is the clothing also made?
It's clothing. So you'll see now the women are going to come out and they have the same pattern. So he's kind of incorporated with the clothing. And then he leaves and, you know, the kind of real show goes on. Although some critics may fault André for his exploitative use of indigenous colors and people to promote his brand, and by extension, the development of South Korea, but his ongoing relationship to the Hawaiian Islands and its multi-ethnic population, including Native Hawaiians, also included charitable gestures aimed at giving back to the communities that hosted him. Attended by 2,000 people, his 1982 fashion show exemplifies his desire to save things Hawaiian, as one local reporter described it. Here, this fashion show honored 8 living and 2 recently deceased matriarchs for their contributions to preserve the culture of pre-colonial Hawaii. To this end, proceeds from each of the $30 tickets help launch a $1 million fund to benefit the Big Island's Mo'okini Heiau, the only place of worship with a direct family line of ritual guardians dating to 400 AD. The fund also aimed to support the erection of a cultural and educational complex near the Mo'okini Luakini, which is today part of Lapaki Historical State Park in North Kohala. So considered as part of his ongoing work as a cultural ambassador, these philanthropic efforts to use fashion as a medium for cross-border dialogues allowed André to fend off criticisms, at least at the time, that he was using overseas fashion shows to exploit native culture for his profit and that of his rapidly industrializing nation. For Korean, Japanese, and other Asian diasporics living on the Hawaiian Islands, but who found themselves still marginalized racially in a white-dominated culture of the US, repeated visits by this world-renowned Asian designer offered them the opportunity to overcome sentiments of racial inferiority. Meanwhile, his visits also promoted local efforts at post-colonial reconciliation in the ongoing wake of Japanese imperialism across the region. Examples of these efforts can be seen in his fashion shows of the mid-1980s and early 1990s, a period in which, after many years, cultural flows between Japan and South Korea reached an unprecedented peak. So I can't possibly discuss all of the events, but let me just, as a way of concluding, mention 3 important ones. So interestingly, André never visited Japan until 1986. He staged his first show in Osaka in the fall of that year, nearly 25 years after he first debuted in Seoul in 1962. Now, André was clearly fascinated with Japanese designs and designers, and one may wonder about the notable delay in visiting Korea's former colonizer. I found that already by the early 1970s, he began to contemplate this question, how to do his first show in Japan. In 1977, he was quoted as saying, I decided to present in New York and Paris earlier than Tokyo because I wanted to go to Tokyo not simply as a designer from Korea, but as a Korean-born designer with a world reputation. I wanted to take that pride with me to Japan. When he finally visited Japan in 1986, he chose Osaka. This might be, again, because this commercial city was home to the largest population of Koreans, most of whom who had migrated during the colonial period. The event was sponsored by the Asia Club, a Japanese organization created in 1974 to promote academic and cultural exchanges among Asian nations. And the 1986 event here aimed to further soften animosities between Japanese and South Koreans. André's 5th and 6th fashion shows in Hawaii continued these efforts at post-colonial reconciliation. As in 1980, the Honolulu Japanese Junior Chamber of Commerce invited André back, this time to celebrate the 35th annual Cherry Blossom Festival in the spring of 1987. So you can see all of the events that the Cherry Blossom Festival had, and one of the events that was incorporated was André's fashion show. The local sponsors helped boost attendance among ethnic Japanese attendees, who reportedly comprised about 70% of all of the people who went to see his fashion show. So the following clip I'm going to show you from the 1987 fashion show will show you André with his young son, about 5 at the time, and the warm reception they received at the Sheraton Waikiki. And André traveled with Chungdo, his son, almost everywhere he went, outfitted him with, that's his clothing as well. And then you'll see the kind of reception he gets. And you'll see Jean Ariyoshi, again, is the first woman to go up and give him a kiss on the cheek. That's Jean Ariyoshi right there. They loved him. In the summer of 1991, he made his 6th visit to Honolulu for another sold-out fashion show, this one attended by approximately 1,000 people. The upcoming Olympics in Barcelona, you'll remember, we lived through this period. André had already been chosen as a featured designer after he triumphantly appeared at the Seoul Olympics of 1998. Now 92 is going to be Barcelona. And Spain served as the background to a program that featured such Spanish themes as flamenco dancing, the artwork of Pablo Picasso and Joan Miró, and structural elements from the talented Spanish architect Gaudí. Even as he continued to incorporate Western elements into his unique cosmopolitan style, the 91 fashion show functioned as another chance for post-colonial reconciliation. Once again, André's appearance alongside Japanese-American residents of Honolulu and Japanese visitors to Oahu indicated the remarkable degree to which his work aimed to, quote, build bridges. And this was a theme of the 1991 event. For him, this work meant bringing together such historically estranged communities as Japanese or Japanese Americans and Koreans or South Koreans. That an ethnic Japanese and the president of a Honolulu charity sold out this event indicates how Asian American groups themselves advanced these cross-cultural efforts, fundraising for student scholarships and community projects. Such charitable work was, of course, a hallmark of André's spectacular shows that began in the 1960s and continued apace during 2 future visits to Honolulu in 1993 and 1996. 93 was to celebrate the 90th anniversary of Korean migration, and he comes back in 1996, and at the time the governor even designated January 28th to become André Kim Day. I'm not sure if you still have that, but he has his day. Now by 1997, we're getting into the late 90s, right? The Asian financial crisis, which resulted in a $58.4 billion bailout from the International Monetary Fund, forced a now democratic regime in South Korea to actively promote popular culture and information technology as responses to the limits of authoritarian era manufacturing. This is essentially where we get K-pop or K-wave. I would call it K-wave 2.0 or maybe 3.0. So if I've suggested in my talk at least some ways in which André Kim contributed to this new Korea wave of the 21st century, then my historical work on this path-breaking designer has succeeded. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, André. Questions, comments for our speaker? Fascinating topic.
Oh, and thank you. Mahalo and kamsahamnida. Yes.
Did André Kim speak English?
He did speak English. I don't know how well he spoke English, but I imagine that with those French ambassadors and others, he was speaking English. But he never studied abroad. He had no, cosmopolitan educational track. This was all sort of self-made education, beginning with his study of films, his study and sketches, and then going to the International Design School. So he became something of a cosmopolitan and a global star through his travels. I'm sure he spoke English. I'm sure he did.
So to follow up
Yes.
on that, so at one point you said that André Kim, a Korean American designer, was he actually Korean American? Did he immigrate to the U.S.?
No, I'm sorry.
No.
That was a misstatement if I said that.
He resided in...
He resided in Korea, yes, full time. And he had his salon near Myeongdong, and then he opened another one that is next to Gyeongbokgung, Samcheongdong area. But he had lots of businesses, both in Korea and then overseas, selling his clothing.
Ken and then Yonga.
Okay. Yeah, Manoa, thank you very much. Just a fascinating figure. First part of your talk concentrated on his gender crossing performance. The second part of your talk talked more about his global presence. So I was wondering whether you could bring the first part into the second,
Yeah.
and say a little bit about how his performance of gender worked in his presence abroad.
I mean, he himself was gender crossing in the sense of his chosen profession. He was marked that way by the mass media. So in that sense, he was a gender crosser. And that's what I meant by that statement. Of course, the discourse about these eccentric professions continued, and André was a part of those discussions. But there was a way in which somehow his global stardom and his iconic status allowed him to sort of elevate himself above those kinds of speculations about his private life or about his chosen profession. So that's the main difference I see with those gender crossing laborers who don't have the kind of platform or international access and cannot extricate themselves from. That was a very Korea-centric discourse. So I think partly by traveling and being away from Korea and being recognized so internationally allowed him to silence his critics. Whereas other fashion designers who didn't have a name for themselves, or those kind of hairdressers, they constantly were sort of fodder for South Korea's mass media that was both fascinated by this phenomena, alarmed by the phenomena. And the mass media, I read as a very complex tool. So on the one hand, they were sensationalizing these kinds of figures and demonizing them. But on the other hand, they were showing folks who saw these pioneers and these icons as people whom they could imitate, people whose path they could follow. So there emerged people who wanted to become the next André Kim. In the larger chapter, I also discuss a hair designer who was named Alexander Kim, who was also a kind of global star. I don't know if he was the first to do it, but in Korea, he pioneered the upside down haircut, where you would take a customer, you know those things where you invert yourself to get better blood circulation, and their hair would be hanging down, and he would cut the hair like this. And he was another person who, not as famous as André Kim, but also through his success internationally. He won all of these awards in Tokyo, and there's a picture, I don't have it here, but Park Jung-hee is watching him as he's like cutting hair in this way and is just kind of amazed by it. So I think there's a way in which these cosmopolitan stars are able to sort of extricate them or leave that Korea-centric discourse around gender-bending professions in a way that, let's say, female taxi drivers who can never take their taxi and like, well, I suppose they could immigrate, but you can't really become a star taxi driver in a way that he becomes a star. So those kind of rumors and those discussions about him as gender bending, that continues, but they're muted because of his stardom.
How does the foreign press present this gender press?
So there was one quote that reiterated something that the foreign press, the Korean press said. So let me just read you a quote of when he came to Hawaii. Let's see, which visit was it? I have the quote right here, which sort of repeats what was being said in Korea itself. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, here. So from his 1972, this is his first visit to Honolulu. In a news report from his first visit, local journalists here in Hawaii reiterated what South Korean commentators had since the early 60s described as an eccentric occupation. As one reporter told readers, quote, "An American girl becoming a plumbing apprentice would probably be the rough equivalent of what it was like for André Kim to enter the fashion school in Korea 10 years ago." So the press sort of reiterates that, but I think internationally there had already been male fashion designers and stars, so they weren't so focused on that. They were focused on his designs. They were focused on the way he brought, let's say, Korean embroidery and put it on a dress, which actually doesn't really follow hanbok style. If anything, it's closer to kimono. André was a real fan of the kimono. So he wants to create these modern dresses but bring in Korean elements, and he's obviously playing on Orientalism and selling Orientalism and packaging Orientalism. So among the white audiences, let's say in Europe or in the United States, they're mostly focused on that. From the Korean American or diasporic population, it seems that this is an opportunity to reconnect with Korea. And at a time when I was trying to think of other icons or stars that were famous in the world in the 60s and 70s and the 80s, and I could come up with no one except André Kim. Wow. So, you know, you'll know better than me what the equivalent is for Japan, what the kind of icons are, or what the kind of cultural styles that folks outside of Japan are going to enjoy in different ways. So I think André was thinking about those kind of multiple audiences, constantly drawing on local Korean audiences to promote his brand, but then also selling Orientalism in a way that was fashionable. So when I talked to Jean Ariyoshi, she told me, well, you know, when I became the governor's wife, I always had to attend these meetings and I needed something to wear. So I'd go to the US mainland and I asked her, like, how did these white governors and their wives like react to these dresses? I mean, it just must have been a real statement. And at a time when there weren't a lot of Asian fashion designers that were popular in the US, I think that you know, he really promoted that in a way that is worth recalling. So I'm not sure how well that answers your question, but.
I was wondering, so he is this very like non-heteronormative guy who went into this profession, you know, that's usually for women, but also he never got married, right? And he
not that I know of.
Yeah, and he adopted a son.
He adopted a son,
which is very kind of unique. But he was hugely successful, and I was wondering, you know, this kind of image of this guy who's, you know, living his, you know, non-heteronormative life, but, you know, yet is hugely successful. Like, did that have an impact on how South Koreans thought about, you know, non-heteronormative people and how, you know, or their existence in South Korean society?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, personally, as a scholar, I'm not really interested in people's personal life, but it was well known that he had a son. Obviously, that was not, as far as I know, not a biological son, which is extremely unusual. He wasn't married, so you could call him a single father.
Right.
That wasn't really used as an expression, but what he was doing was fathering this child. I'm sure he had like help. He had, you know, whatever they called it at that time. Shingmo, I know is not a good word nowadays, but that's what they. So I'm sure that he had that kind of service. I mean, my sense is that everybody knew that he was extremely successful. Everybody knew that to be part of his world was, again, a sign of success. And people didn't so much comment on that part of his career, at least publicly. There was a lot of shishi, kind of, you know, quiet discussion about his life. But my sense and why I wanted to tie it back to this gender comedy and gender bending of male service workers is the way they were laughed at. So the accent, the strange outfits, the like globe-trotting, he was in a sense an eccentric. He was a kind of bohemian. He was also a workaholic, and he was really good at what he did. I don't think he ever took a break in his life. He was dedicated, devoted to his career. How definitely the discourse on eccentric professions, men doing female-dominated jobs and women doing male-dominated jobs, that discourse as a whole, I think, transformed Korea slowly in that direction. So on the one hand, there's admiration. When he becomes successful, people want to draw on his success. But on the other hand, there's this kind of laughable, humorous, strange life that he lives that I don't think people can like put together. And that's partly my speculation why Koreans haven't studied him, because they always imagine him as someone you kind of laugh at, but also kind of admire. So it's a mix of kind of strange emotions, admiration and yet like despicable, or, so I don't know, yeah.
Was it all funded by himself, or was there any kind of, you know, state influence or diplomatic funds going into his overseas shows? I mean, I know that in his later shows, I think it was funded by, you know, Ministry of Culture and all that. So I was wondering, I mean, where does the money coming from? Because I mean, you are talking about sort of overseas cultural strategy of Korea. So I was wondering, you know, how that ties into the whole story.
Yeah, I mean, the Korean Wave story about government promotion of Korea's cultural industries, I mean, that part is obviously different after the 90s. He probably had, I mean, he had some sponsors and some, you know, he knew, he circulated in the networks of like the embassies. So clearly they were some kind of sponsor of his event, but I don't think they provided funding for the event. These were all self-funded fashion shows, as far as I understand. I haven't seen any evidence that suggests that the government was sending him or some other corporation was sending him. He was doing this largely on his own. And he must have had a pretty large staff, not just to make the clothing, but also to put on the shows. That's why I tried to meet Jean Ariyoshi and others who arranged his shows to get a better understanding of how do you put together a fashion show. You have a Seoul-based designer at a time when there's no internet and communications are difficult, and then you need these local organizers to put on the show. And I think that's where these, you know, like the Japanese-American Cherry Blossom Festival organizers, definitely by the '88 Olympics, there was some backing in terms of, you know, putting him on stage. But in terms of a cultural policy that was sort of initiated by the government or supported by the government, I don't see that as being so significant until we get into the sort of the time of the Olympics, into the 90s. So he did this all basically on his own. So it's quite remarkable.
Jung and then André.
So my question is somewhat related to Professor Oz. Actually, the travel, international travel was private, banned in many ways, restricted, I should say, until 1980s in South Korea.
Right.
And so, seeing him so active internationally, I think there could have been some kind of reasons for the government to sponsor this type of activities, including Yu Kyung-soo's wearing his clothing and also making him kind of some type of leaders in new business during economic development process. So I was asking similar question, what, especially knowing that Park Chung-hee and military people didn't like some kind of this real, some decadence, you know,
Right.
or somewhat, like wearing long hair and all those stuff, which was often banned in military
Right.
regime. So probably there could have been some reason for the government to accept that style and even promote that. But my other side of the question is this: so were they really effective for Korea to kind of represent the changes in Korea during the time? So, in other words, were people outside of Korea really enjoying this new phases of Korea, kind of cultivated by him? So how was his design
Reception?
Received by other people, not kind of some Asian people or some people who were from Korea, like in Hawaii or in Japan, like Kyoto community, were the white community in outside really enjoying this type of fashion? And did they also make any kind of contribution to image of Korea? Like a K-wave now is quite, a reflection of different type of Korea.
Right. Well, I suppose the elite sort of fashionistas, like the ambassadors' wives and the people who he connected with, they, in a sense, were promoting his brand for him, but not simply because they liked him as a person. He had a very charismatic personality, and if they met him, as I said, he would often give a dress to somebody, and that was his way of promoting his brand. And so those individuals, when they saw their friends at some, gathering among, well-to-do women, they would wear this dress. And then obviously people would ask, well, where did you get that dress? And who made that dress? Can you get me one of those dresses? So in that sense, I think it did spread, not to the extent that it does now, with other kinds of cultural products, just because of the way that the cultural products could be watched or consumed or sold in different places. I mean, fashion is different than, let's say, Netflix, right, in terms of cultural promotion. But given the limited way and limited infrastructure that Korea had to support someone like him, I'm sure they supported him on the level of travel, because you couldn't travel easily. And you had to get, anti-communist education before you left. Yeah. If you met a North Korean in some other place, what to do with them to not be tricked by them. So I'm sure the government, by the time he had been signing these contracts, were supporting his overseas visits or facilitating his overseas visits. How involved they were in funding that or promoting that, I can't get a clear sense of that, but I don't, at least in the media, which is what I've studied, I've seen no reference to that. I've seen also no reference that, he was an embarrassment, by being a man or by dressing the way he did or by making clothes for women. There was no sense in which he was, deviant. And again, I think that's because he became so successful. He was so entrepreneurial. He was so self-branding. It was something actually that maybe other economic enterprises, it would be interesting to see if they saw him and tried to model their own overseas business in that way. I haven't been able to study that. So it is true that the Park Chung-hee government, especially in the 1970s, cracked down on this kind of decadence thing, this tepe munha. But yet at the same time, that kind of thing is being promoted in South Korea's media. So it's a weird cycle where the government cracks down on it, but then the media is promoting it. And they're promoting it to sell their publications, not without a little bit of the ideological dose of you know, a man doing this fashion designing thing is kind of weird and strange. They have to kind of say that, maybe to pass the censorship. But beyond that, he was well talked about, and individuals like him were being promoted. So it's a weird double-edged sword.
Okay, our last question by our own André. You know what? And then someone back there. Yes.
Thank you for that talk. That was such a treat. I know nothing about fashion, so I won't wade in there. But I was especially intrigued by the role of this fashion icon in post-colonial reconciliation that seemed to especially start here in Hawaii. And I'm wondering if that's significant. The way that the shadow of post-coloniality was maybe displaced or effaced in Hawaii and in Asia, America, more generally. I wonder if when you look at his participation in the Cherry Blossom Festival, was it even remarked on, say local media, that this is breaking down some sort of barrier, or is it not even notable?
That wasn't directly mentioned. That I kind of got out of the sources. And to be honest, I brought a kind of, I think, biased view to Japan-Korea relations. And I was actually happily surprised by what he was able to do in Hawaii. And when I talked with Jean Ariyoshi, that was one of the things I wanted to ask her. It's like, was there any sense that as an ethnic Japanese person living in Hawaii, that when the first fashion designer you wanted to bring to Hawaii, that he was Korean, like what did that mean to you? What significance did that have to you? And what she told me was, what's the name of the place by the Dole huge plantation where many Koreans first settled, like between here?
White Town?
Yeah, I think that's where she grew up. And basically she told me, you know, I grew up around Koreans and they were a part of my upbringing. She said, I used to eat kimchi sandwiches. And, you know, I don't know whether this is how to understand this statement, but she said to me, and obviously I'm white, so she's looking at me as a white American, and she says, you know, in Hawaii, you know, we have a very different kind of inter-ethnic and racial politics, and the kind of things that you're talking about, this animosity that Koreans had to Japanese, basically she said to me, you know, we had much less of that. So I don't know how to analyze that statement, if that's like a denial that I should analyze more carefully, or whether that reflects a very deeply held sentiment. But I think there is something about Hawaii being this kind of place where that was possible. And I think André liked Hawaii. And I think what he wanted to do was to connect the world with it through his fashions. I think there was a way in which Hawaii was a great place for him to try that out. And the fact that these also was remarkable in the Cherry Blossom Festival. I thought they would be all ethnic Japanese, or mostly ethnic Japanese. Again, my bias.
Even today.
Even today, but there are Korean, there are Chinese members of that community. It's quite mixed up, right? So that ethnic Japanese were inviting him as part of their Cherry Blossom Festival, and he was the featured fashion designer. I think that probably gave him some sense that there is this room that I can't quite do this in South Korea. I haven't really gone to Japan, but why don't I do this in Hawaii? This kind of post-colonial reconciliation work. And because the audiences were I wouldn't say predominantly Asian, but on some level, many of the people who went to see his shows were Asian. I think that it was the perfect stage for him. And why he came, if you go back to this first image of his fashion shows before the year 2000, if you look at them on the right side, Hawaii is, he comes here 10 times of all the places he could have done a fashion show. Wow. And he developed really close connections. I missed being able to interview another hair designer here, a white hair designer who is very close to André and who passed away last year. But I bet you if you interview and find people, that those stories would come out even more. That this was really the place where, you know, you have the East-West Center. Not that that's, you know, the same thing, but he was onto something.
Final question.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. I was wondering for the shows in Chile and Argentina, what was some of the composition of the audience for those events also like Korean or Japanese diaspora in South America? Or if you have, you know how you talked about the Cherry Blossom organization here, what were the similar cooperating or organizing organizations in South America?
I know in Argentina and Chile, both places have fairly large Korean populations as far as South America goes, and those local organizations I know were involved. I think and Japanese populations, of course. I haven't seen any evidence that the Japanese populations and the Korean populations there were working together for his shows in the same way that took place in Hawaii. But definitely everywhere he went, he tried to connect with these Korean communities, and they did a lot of the work. So I would also be really interested in talking to some of those former organizers to better understand how they saw him and what meaning his visit and his work meant for their lives here. That's another sort of project, but so in Argentina, I know he worked with local Korean organizations. I didn't see any Japanese organizations involved. If I had enough time, I would go and look, you know, at all. I've tried to track down in all of the sort of local newspapers how he was talked about and discussed. But now we're like 40, 50 years out from his visits, so we're unfortunately losing the people who have memories of him. So, but it's a very good question. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Fascinating talk.
Thank you, everybody.